Blood on the iron rails. The setting sun painted the desert sky like spilled blood on a saloon floor, casting long shadows across the wind-carved rocks of Arizona Territory. Marshal Jake Hawkins studied the railway tracks stretching westward like a steel serpent, knowing somewhere along those iron rails lay the answer to a 3-year hunt that began at Appomattox. The war had changed everything. While brother fought brother back east, the West descended further into lawlessness. Now in 1868, with the Union Pacific driving its way through Indian land, old wounds festered like gangrene in a bullet hole. Hawkins touched the weather-worn wanted poster in his vest pocket. The face of Calvin Reed, Confederate guerrilla-turned-train robber, was burned into his memory deeper than the brand on his ranch's cattle. Reed and his gang had left a trail of bodies from Kansas to California, their latest victim being Hawkins' brother, a conductor on the transcontinental line. The distant thunder of hooves drew his attention to a dust cloud approaching from the east. Through his brass spyglass, Hawkins made out 3 Apache riders moving fast and low across the scrubland. They pulled up short when they spotted him, raising empty hands in greeting. "White man's iron horse brings trouble," the lead warrior called out in careful English. "Bad men plan ambush at Dragon's Backbone Ridge. Many guns." Hawkins nodded slowly. The Apache had no love for the railway cutting through their ancestral lands, but they hated Reed's gang more. The outlaws had burned their winter camp, killing women and children in their sleep. "Much obliged," Hawkins replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Reckon I'll need to have a word with them about train schedules and proper timing." The warrior's face remained impassive, but his dark eyes glinted with understanding. "We will watch from the high places. The desert remembers its debts." As the Apache melted back into the landscape like shadows at high noon, Hawkins urged his horse toward the ridge. Dragon's Backbone was a nasty piece of track, a narrow cut through red rock with steep walls that played tricks with sound. Perfect place for an ambush, if a man was of such a mind. The 310 from Yuma would be coming through in 2 hours, carrying a payroll that would tempt any outlaw worth his salt. But Reed wasn't just after money. No, this was about finishing what started back in Virginia, when Hawkins had tracked down Reed's Confederate raiders and brought them to justice. All except Reed himself, who'd slipped away like a sidewinder in the sand. The saloon keeper back in Copper Creek had warned him that Reed was gathering men, mostly ex-Confederates with too much pride and too little sense. Tough as saddle leather and mean as rattlers, the old-timer had said, watering his whiskey out of habit. Word is they're aiming to hit something big before heading south to Mexico. Hawkins dismounted in a sheltered draw, leading his horse behind a stand of scraggly juniper. The sun was getting low, painting the clouds in shades of purple and gold. Soon the desert would cool, and the night wind would carry sound for miles. He checked his Colt, the same one he'd carried through Shiloh and Cold Harbor, and settled in to wait. The first sign came with the fading light, the subtle movement of men taking positions along the ridge. Hawkins counted 6 shapes moving through the gathering dusk. Reed always did like to stack the odds in his favor. The distant whistle of the approaching train echoed off the canyon walls like a banshee's wail. Hawkins moved then, quiet as falling snow, working his way up the backside of the ridge. The first outlaw never knew what hit him, Hawkins' rifle, but caught him just below the ear, dropping him like a sack of feed. The second man managed a startled curse before Hawkins' knife found his throat. The remaining lookouts were too focused on the approaching train to notice their dwindling numbers until it was too late. When Reed finally realized something was wrong, he spun with his gun, already clearing leather. Fast as a striking rattler, but Hawkins was waiting for it. Their shots crashed together like thunder, echoing off the canyon walls. Reed staggered, crimson blossoming across his chest like desert primrose after rain. His eyes went wide with recognition as he fell. "Should have stayed in Virginia, Reed," Hawkins said softly, watching the life fade from his old enemy's eyes. The train rumbled past, its passengers never knowing how close they'd come to disaster. The Apache materialized from the darkness like spirits as the last car disappeared around the bend. Without a word, they began gathering the dead. Hawkins reloaded his Colt and mounted up. There'd be paperwork waiting in town, and a telegraph to send east about Reed's demise. But first, he needed a drink. The desert night was rolling in like a tide, and somewhere a coyote called out to the rising moon, singing an old song about justice and vengeance in the wild lands where civilization hung by a thread as thin as a strand of barbed wire. If you are enjoying adventures in the Old West channel, hit the subscribe button for future posts.